Welcome aboard the interstellar starship Genesis. Together, we'll journey beyond the boundaries of known space, explore distant worlds, and witness the quiet wonders of the universe. If you enjoy relaxing sci-fi sleep stories like this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to join us on future voyages. Now find a comfortable place to rest. Take a slow, gentle breath, and whenever you're ready, let the journey begin. Chapter 1. What happened to them? What happened to them? That was the question we carried with us every time we entered the structure. Decades had passed since Genesis left Earth. By then, the stars around us were no longer unfamiliar points of light. They had become places we could study and, eventually, places we could reach. Nothing in our journey, however, had prepared us for what we found here. An enormous artificial structure stood silently in the darkness of interstellar space. It was ancient. It was unmistakably constructed. And it was completely empty. We did not know who had built it. We did not know why they had built it. And we had no evidence that the civilization itself was gone. That was the first answer we had found. Whatever had happened to the people who built this place, it had not happened here. 3 months had passed since we first entered the structure. During that time, our exploration had become slower and more methodical. We no longer expected every new chamber to reveal something extraordinary. Instead, we looked for small details that might eventually connect to something larger. Our exploration teams moved carefully through the structure, while autonomous drones traveled into regions that were too distant for us to reach. Everything they found was brought back into Genesis's growing archive of observations. The ship's onboard intelligence helped us make sense of that enormous amount of information. It did not translate the symbols. It did not understand the civilization that had created them. It simply allowed us to compare observations on a scale that would have been impossible for the crew to manage alone. A pattern discovered in one chamber could be compared with observations made hundreds of kilometers away. A material could be matched against samples collected weeks earlier. A symbol could be searched for throughout everything we had recorded. Most of the time, these comparisons told us very little. Then, occasionally, something appeared that made us stop. Sometimes I would remain inside the structure for a few quiet moments after the rest of the team had returned to the shuttle. I would switch off my helmet light and simply stand there. A faint blue illumination continued through the corridors around me. We had never found an obvious source for it. It simply remained. After 3 months, the silence had become familiar. The mystery had not. Whatever civilization had created this place had existed long before humanity ever left Earth. Yet we still had no idea where its people had gone. They could have died out. They could have left this region of space. They could have changed in ways we could not yet imagine. At that point, we had no evidence for any of those possibilities. We could only keep looking. Near the end of our 3rd month, the onboard intelligence identified something unusual. It had been comparing symbols found in distant sections of the structure when it noticed that some sequences appeared repeatedly. The same symbols occurred in the same order. Sometimes they were separated by enormous distances, yet the sequence remained consistent. We still had no idea what they meant. They might have represented numbers. They might have described movement through space. They might have recorded something about the civilization itself. We simply did not have enough evidence to know, but we now knew that the sequences were not random. Someone had created a system, and that changed our investigation. We had spent 3 months searching for clues about the civilization that built this place. Now we had found our first clue that might allow us to understand the way they communicated. We did not know their language. We did not know their history. We did not know where they had gone. But we finally had something we could test. And for the first time, we had a way forward. Chapter 2. The first pattern. The discovery did not give us a translation. It gave us something more useful, a way to test our assumptions. We began by looking at the simplest sequences we had found. The onboard intelligence gathered every occurrence and compared the symbols surrounding them. It examined their position within each chamber and searched for relationships between sequences that appeared hundreds of kilometers apart. At first, the results were inconclusive. A repeated symbol could mean almost anything. It might represent an object. It might represent a number. It might be part of a written language. It might mean something we had no concept for at all. We had to resist the temptation to decide before the evidence was there. So we looked for patterns that could be tested. The first useful discovery came when we noticed that some sequences always appeared in the same order. One sequence was followed by another. That sequence was followed by a third. The same progression appeared in different parts of the structure. It was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Still, consistency wasn't enough. We needed a prediction. The onboard intelligence identified a sequence that appeared to be missing from one section of the structure. If our interpretation was correct, it should appear in a nearby chamber that we had not yet examined. We sent a drone. When the images returned, the sequence was there. We checked the location again. Then we checked the surrounding structures. The prediction held. We repeated the process with another sequence, then another. Each time, the results became harder to explain as coincidence. Something had been deliberately arranged here. We still couldn't read it, but we were beginning to understand its structure. That distinction mattered. We were no longer staring at symbols and asking what they meant. We were asking why they appeared in that particular order. The answer began to emerge slowly. The simplest sequences appeared first. More complicated sequences came later. The same progression appeared again in distant sections of the structure. It was as though the information had been arranged so that one understanding could lead naturally to the next. We couldn't yet say why, but the pattern suggested that whoever created this system had considered the possibility that the person discovering it might know nothing about their civilization. That was a remarkable possibility. We had expected to find information left behind by an advanced species. Instead, we were finding something that seemed designed to make that information understandable. We still had no idea what the first lesson was. We didn't know where their history began. We didn't know where their civilization had gone. And we certainly didn't know what the structure ultimately intended to tell us. But after 3 months of searching, we had finally found the first thread. Now we had to follow it. Chapter 3. A language without a language. The next breakthrough took weeks, not because the symbols became easier to understand, because we finally stopped trying to read them as words. Instead, we began studying the relationships between them. The onboard intelligence reconstructed every sequence we had recorded and placed them into a single model. It compared symbols from different sections of the structure and looked for patterns that remained consistent regardless of where they appeared. At first, the results told us very little. A repeated symbol could have meant almost anything. It could have represented an object, an idea, a number, or something for which we had no equivalent. We had to be careful not to assign meaning simply because we wanted to find it. So we started with the one thing we knew had to exist independently of language: mathematics. We tested simple numerical relationships against the sequences we had recorded. The first results were inconclusive. Then we began looking at geometry. That changed things. Certain relationships appeared to correspond with patterns already present in the structure itself. The same proportions appeared in distant chambers. The same geometric relationships appeared beside several of the sequences we were studying. None of this gave us a translation, but it gave us something more important: a way to test our assumptions. We began comparing increasingly complex mathematical relationships with the sequences. Some matched, others did not. Whenever a prediction failed, we discarded the assumption and started again. When a prediction succeeded, we looked for another place where the same relationship should appear. Slowly, the pattern became clearer. The system was not using mathematics as a subject. Mathematics was the foundation that allowed the system to communicate. That realization changed everything. The civilization that created this place had not left behind a simple dictionary for future generations. They had created a method by which someone who knew nothing about them could begin to understand. That raised an even bigger question. Why had they gone to such extraordinary lengths? We didn't know. But we now had a way to continue. We returned to the sequences that appeared after the mathematical relationships we had identified. This time, we weren't trying to translate them. We were looking for what they were connected to. One particular sequence appeared in several distant sections of the structure. Each time, it was associated with the same geometric pattern. The onboard intelligence compared those patterns with the astronomical data we had collected during our journey. The comparison produced several possible matches. Most were meaningless. Then one remained. A star. It was not a star we had visited. It was not even one we had previously considered important. But the same stellar reference appeared repeatedly throughout the structure. We checked the result. Then we checked it again. The evidence continued to point to the same place. For the first time since entering the structure, we discovered something that could exist outside it. A location, a direction, a point in the galaxy that appeared to matter to the civilization that had created this place. We still didn't know why. We didn't know whether it was their home. We didn't know whether it was a destination, and we certainly didn't know what we would find there. But after months of studying symbols, we could barely understand. We finally had our first connection between the structure and the wider galaxy. Somewhere among the stars, there was a place they had wanted us to find. Chapter 4. The star they came from. The discovery gave us our first possible destination. Until then, everything we had learned had come from inside the structure. Now we had a point in the sky. We were careful not to assume what it meant. The star appeared repeatedly in the information we'd begun to decode, but the structure was ancient. The position we observe today could not simply be compared with a position recorded millions of years earlier. Stars move. Over immense periods of time, their positions change significantly. So we began reconstructing the sky as it would have appeared when the structure was created. It took weeks. The onboard intelligence calculated possible stellar movements and compared them with every astronomical reference we had found inside the structure. Most of the possibilities quickly disappeared. The positions did not match. The distances were wrong. The surrounding stars were inconsistent, but one system continued to fit. We checked it again using a different set of observations. The result was the same. We checked the surrounding stars. They matched as well. Then we found another reference inside the structure. It pointed toward the same region of space. That was when the significance became difficult to ignore. This was not simply a star that appeared in their records. It appeared to be a fixed reference point. Something about this system had mattered enough for them to preserve its location. We still couldn't say exactly why. It could have been a destination. It could have been a place of historical importance. It could have been something we had not yet considered. But there was one possibility none of us could ignore. This might be where their story had begun. We searched the information surrounding the stellar reference for anything that could tell us more. The sequences were becoming easier to distinguish now, but we were still far from fluent in the system. Every new interpretation had to be tested. Every assumption had to survive comparison with something else we had already observed. Eventually, another pattern emerged. The stellar reference was not alone. Something else was consistently associated with it. A smaller set of symbols appeared alongside the star whenever the information became more detailed. We didn't understand them yet, but their placement suggested that the structure was narrowing our attention. It was taking us from something enormous toward something specific, a star, then a system within that star's surroundings, and perhaps a world. We had spent months trying to understand where this civilization had gone. Now, for the first time, we had a reasonable chance of discovering where it had begun, and that changed the question once again. We were no longer simply trying to understand what they had left behind. We were beginning to follow their history back to its source. Chapter 5. The world they left behind. The star was only the beginning. We still needed to determine why it appeared so often throughout the structure. The onboard intelligence searched through every sequence associated with the stellar reference and compared them with the information surrounding it. At first, there was very little we could understand. The symbols were still unfamiliar, and we had only begun to establish the rules governing their arrangement. So we returned to what we could test. If the star represented a location, then other information associated with it should tell us something about that location. We began comparing the sequences with the astronomical data we had collected. The first attempts produced nothing useful. Then one comparison produced a result that was close enough to investigate further. We changed our assumptions and ran the calculation again. The relationship remained. A particular object within the star system appeared to correspond with another sequence preserved inside the structure. We checked it independently, then we checked it again. The same world continued to appear. We still could not say that it was the home world, but we now had evidence that this particular world mattered. That gave us another question to investigate. If the structure was preserving information about a place within this star system, what else had been preserved alongside it? We searched the surrounding sequences. The work became increasingly difficult as the information grew more complex. Every interpretation had to be tested against something we already understood. A result that worked once was not enough. We needed it to work again and again. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The sequences associated with the world appeared to describe more than its position. Some seemed connected to its physical characteristics. Others appeared to describe changes that had occurred over time. We couldn't yet understand the details, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. The structure was preserving information about a world, and if our interpretation was correct, that world had been important to the civilization that created this place. For the first time, we had something more than a location. We had the beginning of a history. We still didn't know where the civilization had gone. We didn't know whether they had survived. But we were beginning to understand where their story had started. And that raised a question none of us had considered when we first entered the structure. If they had gone to such extraordinary lengths to preserve the memory of their world, what else had they decided was important enough to survive them? Chapter 6. The distance between them. The discovery changed the way we looked at the information we had already recovered. Until then, we'd been studying the civilization from the perspective of its beginning. Now we were seeing evidence of what happened after it reached the stars. The sequences associated with the original star appeared alongside references to other locations. At first, we assumed those locations were nearby. They weren't. Some were separated from the original system by hundreds of light years. Others were even farther away. We checked the calculations repeatedly because the distances seemed almost impossible. The results did not change. Whatever civilization had created the structure had spread far beyond its original home. That alone wasn't surprising. Humanity had already begun imagining the same future. Once a civilization develops the ability to travel between stars, there is no obvious reason for it to remain in one system forever. What surprised us was how much of that expansion had been preserved. The structure contained references to distant locations that had no apparent connection to one another, except for their relationship to the original star. We began plotting them. One by one, they appeared across our navigation display. The pattern was difficult to appreciate at first. Then we stepped back and looked at the entire map. The points stretched across an enormous region of the galaxy. For a moment, nobody spoke. We had spent months wondering whether the civilization had survived. Now we were looking at evidence that its reach had once been immense. But the distances created another problem. Even with the technology represented inside the structure, the journey between these places would have taken an extraordinary amount of time. Messages would have taken years to cross the gaps. People traveling between distant settlements could spend most of their lives in transit, the farther the civilization spread, the harder it would become to remain connected. That was something we understood. Genesis had already spent decades traveling away from Earth. Even now, every message we sent home became a piece of history before it could arrive. We knew what distance did to communication. We knew what it meant to be separated by years of travel. But the people who built this structure had experienced something on a scale humanity had never encountered. Their settlements were not simply separated by oceans. They were separated by stars. And the farther we followed their history, the more important that distance seemed to become. We still didn't know what had happened to them. We hadn't found evidence of extinction. We hadn't found evidence that they had abandoned their worlds. We had only discovered that they had spread farther than we had imagined. Yet one thought stayed with me as I looked at the map. If all of these distant places had once belonged to the same civilization, how long could they remain one? We didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time, we understood that the distance between their worlds might be more important than anything we had found inside the structure. Chapter 7. The First Separation. The map remained on the display long after we had finished studying it. We had expected to find evidence that the civilization had spread between the stars. We had not expected to find evidence that its distant settlements had begun to change. The first indication came from the communication system itself. By then, we had learned enough to recognize some of the patterns that appeared throughout the structure. They were not yet a language we could read fluently, but we could identify relationships between sequences. That allowed us to compare records associated with different star systems. At first, the differences seemed insignificant. A sequence would appear almost identical in two distant locations, with only a small variation separating them. We assumed the difference might be an error. Then we found another, and another. The same basic system appeared across the civilization, but the further we followed it from the original star, the more variations we began to encounter. The changes were subtle. A symbol could be altered. A sequence could be shortened. A relationship that appeared in one region could be expressed differently somewhere else. Individually, none of these differences meant very much. Together, they revealed something we hadn't expected. The people living in those distant systems had not remained completely connected. Their communication was changing. We knew what that meant because we had seen it happen on Earth. Human languages had never remained perfectly still. People separated by oceans and mountains developed different ways of speaking over generations. Eventually, those differences became large enough that people who had once shared a language could no longer understand one another easily. The civilization inside this structure had faced the same process, only their distances were incomprehensibly greater. An ocean can separate two communities for centuries. A distance of hundreds of light years could separate them for thousands of generations. The more we studied the records, the harder it became to think of these distant settlements as a single society. They had begun with the same foundation. They had carried the same system of communication into the stars, but separation was slowly changing them. We couldn't yet tell how far that process had gone. We didn't know whether the different settlements still considered themselves part of the same civilization. We didn't even know whether they could still understand one another. But we had discovered something that changed the question we had been asking since the beginning. We had been searching for the moment when this civilization disappeared. Now we were beginning to wonder whether there had ever been a single moment at all. Perhaps distance had done something much slower. Perhaps it had separated them one generation at a time. And if that was true, then the empty structure around us might not be the remains of a civilization that had vanished. It might be the record of a civilization that had gradually become many. Chapter 8. When one civilization became many. The evidence of change forced us to look more closely at the distant settlements. Until then, we had treated them as different locations belonging to the same civilization. That assumption was becoming harder to defend. The records associated with each system were developing their own patterns. Some still followed the same underlying structure we had been learning. Others contained variations that appeared nowhere else. At first, we thought the differences might simply reflect the environments of the worlds where those settlements had been established. That would have been reasonable. A civilization living beneath an ocean would have different needs from one living on the surface of a dry world. Different environments would naturally lead to different technologies. But the differences we were finding went beyond that. The records were beginning to describe the same ideas in different ways. Some technologies that appeared fundamental in one system were absent from another. Other systems had developed technologies that appeared nowhere in the older records. The longer we followed the history, the more pronounced those differences became. We began comparing the earliest records from each system with the later ones. The pattern was unmistakable. The further the settlements moved from their original home, and the longer they remained separated, the more they changed. Their languages changed. Their technologies changed. And eventually, the way they described themselves changed as well. One record referred to a distant settlement using terminology that clearly separated it from the civilization's original identity. We searched for the same distinction elsewhere. It appeared again. Then we found it in records from another system. The pattern continued. There had been no single moment when they broke apart. There was no declaration that marked the end of their civilization. No war had divided them. No catastrophe had forced them apart. The separation had happened gradually. A settlement became more independent. Its language developed in a different direction. Its technology followed its own path. After enough generations, the people living there had begun to think of themselves as something distinct from the civilization their ancestors had left behind. The physical distance had become cultural distance, and eventually, cultural distance had become something deeper. They still shared a common origin. They still possessed knowledge inherited from the same civilization. But they no longer appeared to think of themselves as one people. That discovery changed the question we had been asking since we entered the structure. We had been searching for the moment when this civilization disappeared. There wasn't one. Nothing had destroyed them. They had simply spread far enough apart that the civilization they once shared had gradually become many. We sat with that realization for a long time. The structure around us suddenly seemed different. We were no longer looking at the remains of a civilization that had vanished. We were looking at the record of a civilization that had changed into something else. And that left us with a question that was harder to answer. If they knew their descendants would eventually become separate civilizations, why had they worked so hard to preserve the memory of where they had all begun? Chapter 9. A place to remember. The question stayed with us. Why preserve all of this? We had found the location of the original world. We had traced the spread of the civilization across distant stars, and we had watched through their own records as those distant settlements gradually became something different from the society that had sent them there. But none of that explained the structure. If they knew their civilization would eventually divide, why preserve its history for people who might no longer consider themselves part of it? We returned to the records associated with the original star. This time, we searched for connections between the history of their home world and the information we had found about their distant settlements. The connection was there. It appeared in places we had previously considered unrelated. The same origin was referenced alongside different branches of their civilization. The further we followed those references, the clearer the pattern became. The structure was not preserving only the history of the people who had built it. It was preserving the history of everyone who had come from them. That changed the way we understood the archive. The information about their homeworld was not simply a record of where they had begun. It was a reference point, a place that every distant descendant could eventually trace themselves back to. We found the same idea repeated in their records of science and technology. Important discoveries had been preserved alongside the history of their civilization. So had the knowledge required to understand those discoveries. The structure was preserving more than facts. It was preserving context. Who had discovered something, where it had happened, what came before it, and how that knowledge had shaped the civilization that followed. The deeper we went, the more deliberate it became. Someone had considered the possibility that the people discovering this information might be separated from its creators by an almost unimaginable amount of time. They might speak a different language. They might have different customs. They might live on worlds the original civilization had never seen. They might no longer think of themselves as belonging to the same people. Yet they would still be able to trace their history back to the same beginning. That was when the purpose of the structure finally began to make sense. It wasn't built to preserve a civilization that expected to remain unchanged. It was built for the civilizations that would come after it changed. For descendants who might one day look back and wonder where their story had begun. For the first time, we understood why the structure had been designed to survive for so long. Its creators had not been trying to preserve their future. They had been trying to preserve their past. And perhaps they had understood something that humanity had only just begun to consider. A civilization can survive long after it stops being one civilization. Its people can spread across the stars. Their languages can change. Their cultures can separate. Their technologies can diverge. But somewhere beneath all of that, there can still be a shared beginning. And this structure had been built so that beginning would never be completely forgotten. Chapter 10: What We Leave Behind. By the time we understood what the structure had been preserving, we had stopped looking for a single final message. There was no sentence waiting for us at the end. There was something much larger. The information connected the civilization to its original world. It preserved the knowledge that had allowed them to reach the stars, and it recorded the distant settlements that had grown from that beginning. Most importantly, it preserved the connection between them. The method they had chosen made that possible. They had not relied on a language that could remain unchanged for millions of years. They had built their information from relationships that could be rediscovered by anyone capable of understanding the same physical universe. Mathematics gave us the foundation. From there, the information led toward astronomy, history, technology, and eventually the story of the civilization itself. The structure had been designed so that someone separated from its creators by an almost unimaginable amount of time could still work backward toward the beginning. That was the part that affected us most. The civilization had known that its descendants would change. They had known that their languages would evolve, their cultures would diverge, their settlements would become increasingly distant from one another. Yet they had still chosen to preserve a common record, not because they believed change could be prevented, because they understood that change was inevitable. We returned to the records of the distant settlements and looked at them differently. Those people had traveled farther than we had. They had established new worlds and developed societies of their own. They had become different from the civilization that first reached for the stars. But the archive still connected them to the same beginning. That was when we began to understand what Genesis might eventually become. For decades, this ship had carried humanity away from Earth in search of what existed beyond our own world. We had thought of exploration as movement. We traveled farther. We saw more. We discovered places no human being had ever seen. But standing inside that ancient structure, surrounded by the record of another civilization's journey, exploration began to mean something different. One day, humanity would spread in the same way. Our settlements would become separated by distances that could not be crossed quickly. Their histories would begin to diverge. Their languages would change. Their cultures would develop in directions Earth could never predict. Eventually, some of those people might no longer think of themselves as Earthlings. They might never see Earth again. And yet, they would still have begun there. For the first time, we understood that surviving as a species and remaining one civilization were not necessarily the same thing. Humanity could survive for millions of years. It could spread across thousands of worlds. It could become many different societies and still have a shared beginning. Before we left, we began preserving our own record, not because we believed humanity was about to disappear, because we now understood that the farther humanity traveled, the more important its shared history would become. The civilization that created this place had understood that long before us. They had left something behind so that their descendants could find the beginning of their story. Genesis would leave with the same responsibility. We would continue toward the next star, but we would also carry a record of where we had begun. And as I looked back at the structure for the last time, one question remained. If this place had been built so that descendants could find their way back to their shared origin, then where were those descendants now? Chapter 11. What became of them? We had spent months asking what happened to the civilization that built the structure. By then, we finally had an answer. They had not disappeared. They had changed. The final records gave us enough information to follow their history far beyond the period when their settlements first began separating from one another. The further we followed those records, the more independent branches appeared. A settlement would establish another settlement. That new settlement would eventually develop in its own direction. Its language would change. Its technology would begin following problems unique to its own world. Generations would pass, then another branch would appear. There was no final record of a civilization simply vanishing. Instead, the original civilization became increasingly difficult to identify. Its descendants were everywhere. Some still preserved parts of the old knowledge. Others had developed systems that no longer resembled anything created by the original civilization. Some continued to remember their ancient home. Others had traveled so far that the world of their ancestors had become little more than a distant historical reference. The civilization had not been destroyed. It had become many civilizations. That was the answer we had been searching for. There had been no single disaster, no final battle, no moment when the lights went out across their worlds. Their separation had happened slowly, over generations. Distance had done what distance always does. It had made communication harder. It had made travel slower. It had given isolated populations enough time to become different from one another. Eventually, the descendants no longer thought of themselves as one people. The structure was the proof. It had preserved their common beginning because their creators understood that their shared identity would not survive indefinitely on its own. That was why the information began with mathematics. That was why it could be understood without knowing their original language. That was why their history had been preserved alongside their discoveries. They had created something that could survive changes in language, culture, technology, and tummy. They had built a way for descendants who no longer recognized themselves as one civilization to discover that they had once shared the same beginning. We stood quietly inside the structure after reaching that conclusion. For months, we had been looking into the past. Now the past was looking back at us, because Genesis had already begun the same journey. Decades had passed since we left Earth. Every year we traveled farther from the civilization that had built us. The distance between Genesis and Earth continued to grow. Communication already took years. One day, it would take much longer. If humanity continued expanding between the stars, there would eventually be worlds whose inhabitants had never seen Earth. Their ancestors would have left long before their birth. Their cultures would develop independently. Their languages would change. And eventually, they might stop thinking of themselves as part of the civilization that began on Earth. That was the part none of us could ignore. The builders had not shown us a civilization that had failed. They had shown us what happened when a civilization succeeded at becoming interstellar. They had reached the stars. They had spread between them. And in doing so, they had become something new. We had come here looking for evidence of another civilization. Instead, we had found a mirror. The structure preserved the memory of where they had begun. Before we left, we began doing the same for ourselves. Genesis would carry a record of Earth, a record of humanity's first journey beyond the solar system, a record of what we had learned here, not because we expected humanity to disappear, because we now understood that one day humanity might become too large and too distant to remember itself as one civilization. We would continue exploring, we would continue moving toward other stars, and perhaps, millions of years from now, descendants of humanity would stand somewhere in the galaxy and wonder where their story had begun. When that happened, we wanted them to be able to find the answer. Earth. That was the final thing we carried away from the structure. Not a weapon, not a warning, not a promise that the civilization would return. A memory, a shared beginning. And as Genesis turned toward the next stage of its journey, I looked back at the structure one last time. For millions of years, it had waited in the darkness for someone to understand why it existed. Now we did. And for the first time since leaving Earth, I wondered what humanity would become when there were no longer any stars close enough to call home. Our journey comes to an end. For now. Thank you for traveling aboard the interstellar starship Genesis. If you'd like to continue exploring the stars with us, please consider subscribing for future voyages. Until we meet again, sleep well and safe travels.